Thank you very much for having me here today. And I realize I'm the last speaker. And so I want to tell you one thing is that how many people here have ever had some wine in the past year? Do you like wine? Anybody like wine here? Does anybody like Malbec wine? Ever hear of that? Okay, so this has something to do with the wine. Just wanted to let you know. I'm not going to be able to give you any wine, but it does have something to do with wine. And if you're very attentive, maybe I'll buy you a bottle after this talk. All right. So everybody here has been talking about the university, and I'm not going to talk about the university. What I do is I look at poor countries around the world to try to figure out how can they innovate and compete in the world. And I've done everything from looking at entrepreneurship to high-tech innovation clusters. And a lot of this has been around Latin America, previously in Eastern Europe. So a common thread that you've heard today is about interdisciplinary research and how essentially you build mechanisms or structures to connect people that previously were in isolation, so to speak. And if you put them together, you could have some sort of exponential growth and knowledge. And that is one of the things I'm going to talk about, particularly how you can link the formal and the informal, because in the developing world and emerging markets, the informal is the dominant form, and so are lots and lots and lots of small, medium-sized firms. In fact, the vast majority of production and employment is in small, medium-sized firms, and they don't have much resources. So you think about, how do I get innovation in a world without much resources and limited training? And the upshot that we've found over the years is, one, an emphasis on applied and experiential knowledge, not pioneering knowledge. So this goes a little bit against the grain in the notion of the importance of the research university. While important, it's not determinant. And the second part of this is you can construct institutions that provide different types of knowledge resources, but you can construct them in a way so that they actually become social and knowledge bridges between, say, different producer communities or different functional areas of knowledge. Essentially, what we're trying to say is there is public policy that can reconstruct networks. We talk about social networks. There's a huge area of research in innovation about networks, and actually you can affect them. And that's essentially what I've seen already in the university environment by way of the presentations that you've already seen. Okay, so in my world, the general problem is, how do we, beyond growth, how do we get firms to innovate and compete in the world, and what kind of knowledge do they need, and where can they get it? So just to anticipate where this talk is going, one of the things is I'd look at upgrading, so product upgrading, process upgrading. This is a Schumpeterian form of innovation. It's directional. It's about creating greater value added consistently, and it's about adaptation. This process, demands a lot of coordination and what we call recombination. These actors lack resources. And one of the things I think we're all hearing already in this session is, well, money's important to get people to the table, but the key resources are actually there in front of you. And a lot of this is about putting them together in new ways. So you must look at how inter-organizational networks and institutions can be constructed in new ways to build those social and knowledge bridges. So in the developing world, when you talk about innovation and growth and entrepreneurship even, they basically say there's two types of knowledge for companies. There's the imported knowledge and the local knowledge. So the imported knowledge is pioneering technology brought in by the MNCs, and the whole, for 20, 30 years, the whole assumption largely has been the more you bring it in, the better. The closer your firms are to these multinationals in terms of being suppliers, the better. But actually, we find that that isn't true. And this is where the twist becomes, the twist is in the story, and where recombination happens. And this begins a story of you have to run, or you have to walk before you can run. The basic idea here is that actually multinationals aren't very good, and nor are they very interested in transferring proprietary knowledge to suppliers, especially when, or any community of firms, especially when those actors are pretty far behind the technological curve. So what you find out, whether you're in Mexico or Brazil or Argentina, and I could extend this into Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and some other places in China, is that you have large numbers of firms who are potentially or even partially into the supply chains, and they're not learning much. Because what they're done is they're told what to do, but they're never told how to do it or why they're doing it. And this is all about applied knowledge, again, and experiential knowledge. Think about change. The other source of knowledge is local knowledge. So you have a lot of actors who live for generations in these communities of firms, and within these communities there may be a lot of sharing going on and potential innovation. But the problem is that these communities are largely shut off from one another for a number of reasons. And they're either geographically shut off or functionally shut off or professionally disciplines-wise, they don't talk, silos. And you could pick apart one industry after another. And I do, by the way, this view of, that we're developing here in the research actually extends not just to, we realize, not just to, say, Latin America or Southeast Asia, but it actually extends to any place where you find, say, sunset industries are in need of big economic restructuring, even in the advanced world. So the potential solutions that we're finding here are actually non-market institutions, institutions that will provide different services to firm. Again, we're talking about extension services, training, R&D, technical, schooling is a big area, export promotion. But what the key thing is that it's not just about putting resources into them. It's about, first, how you construct their governance. How you, and in the way of doing that, you can then have them become anchors of multi-actor networks. Essentially, as your, say, a research board can do, but you're mandating by the rules that representatives of these different communities, if they want to play, they have to participate actively in these institutions. And again, what we're finding out is that as they do use these participatory governance structures, you actually get a whole lot of bang for the buck. You don't spend a lot of money. You just spend a little of what you've already been spending, but in a new way. And what happens is that you're acquiring a variety of knowledge, and you're being able to combine these into new services and then diffuse these to the firms. And so they're actually getting exposed to not only more knowledge, but actually more critical knowledge that's relevant to what they do. Knowledge that actually exists around them, but they never knew existed or could tap into before. And I'll give you an idea, and as they do that, then they can really take advantage of, say, pioneering knowledge. Okay, and I'll give you an idea. This comes to the wine story. So I've looked at this in all different industries and technologies. The funnest one, of course, is talking about wine. Who wouldn't want to talk about wine or even do product tasting? So most of you by now know something, that there's this thing called Argentine wine out there. What you may not know is that this industry has existed for over 100 years, particularly in the province of Mendoza. And it's, for 100 to 150 years, it's been one of the largest producers by volume of wine in the world, with exporting basically none of it. It's a lot of bad wine, right? And along with that, as you may have known, Argentina doesn't have the greatest reputation in its institutional strength. And in fact, if you look at the industry, like many other industries where it is, you have many, many, many actors. There's not a problem that you don't have entrepreneurs, for instance. You have tons of entrepreneurs. Everybody's an entrepreneur there. And you have tons of different centers and associations, but they're very fragmented historically. And they're in these little groups, and they conflict over every public policy and infrastructure issue. So there's actually tens of thousands of grape producers and approximately 1,200 winemakers, okay? So how did they transform themselves? What's fascinating is there was not a process of consolidation like you may have seen in Chile, but actually they did a massive restructuring even within 10 years of most of their vineyards. And they compete in the world on product innovation. They actually are constantly turning out new types of products, wine products, and new types of grapes. in a rate that's unseen before, and the Chileans are getting nervous, and by 2010 they're the number 4 exporter into the United States in dollar terms. So they have some success, and this is a big turnaround. So the big question is, how did they do it, and why did it take 100 years for this to come about, and why didn't their neighbors do it? They have neighboring provinces that were unable to do it. And it's not just about cost. Well, what it is about constructing these, what we call these new public-private institutions that act as bridges. And I just want to give you a simplified form. So this is Mendoza in 1989. This is sort of the world of winemaking policy. And this is really simplified. So in the bottom, you have firms. Those are those little dots. And they all live in these different zones, geographic zones, and parts of the value chains. I've really simplified. Within these value chains and zones, there is some level of cooperation, and each has its association and maybe center for something. This is typical of any industry. But each of these actors, representatives, compete against each other and try to take money from the state or try to gain something in public policy, a tax break. But there's no horizontal relationship either between the firms in these different zones or even between their representatives in the policy world. Fast forward to 2000. Now this looks like very complicated, and it is a messy spaghetti picture. These arrows, though, in the middle level of the picture are essentially arrows of resource commitments and also board representation. Because those mid-level boxes, the new ones, where you see Pro, MSZ, INTA, IDR, they're these new public-private institutions that are doing export promotion, new R&D labs, new extension services. If you're related to agro, we're in the SEC. Extension services are the backbone, one would say, of the American agricultural experience, et cetera, et cetera. And these came about, by the way, not by some grand plan. It was all through experiments and all through basically over a 12-year period. One thing led to another, problem solving, problem solving. What I want to show here, though, to give you an idea, is who's making these institutions. They're neither public nor are they private. They're not purely voluntary. They're public-private. So the private actors are putting in investments. Their business associations are putting resource commitments, but they also have a right at the table. They are running these institutions with the others. And what's very interesting when you say put money up, so why would these actors who hate each other literally come together and think strategically? It's because when the governor said, I'm putting the money that we use for this issue now for use, and I want you to tell me what is about it, well, the competitors show up, because if I don't show up, the others are going to show up. But then rules are constructed for them to do problem solving. So they have a mission. They have to create the mission. To make a long story short, this massively changed, but in a relatively short period of time, all the services around the wine industry, but also in other agricultural related industries. And then it filtered down to the firms. So the horizontal ties you see on the bottom is that the firms themselves started to learn about firms in these different zones and started to have the experiences exactly that Bruce was talking about. And I can show you this in another way. So I've collected all different data, performance data, innovation data. We did surveys. This is board data. So all these dots are largely business associations. What you can't see here, there's about 200 dots that are not there because the business associations, they couldn't be handled by the software. But what that is all these business associations are isolates. They have their own little world, and they're not connected to anybody else. The only worlds that you see up here are the cooperatives. You have some competing industry federations. You have some government association and an association of elites. And so by 1993, they create a couple of public-private institutions. This was related to marketing and R&D. And already, because of the boards, I'm not adding anything here. By the way, I'm not adding any new business association. All I'm doing is adding a few public-private institutions that create services to support the industry. And all I'm doing is connecting them through their board membership. So by 2002, this is the same group of people, or the same group of institutional and organizational actors. But these black little boxes in the middle are all these new public-private institutions. And because of their board membership, these actors who were previously balkanized or fragmented, even at times at war with each other, are now connected. And they're connected horizontally, working on strategic projects together. And it's taken a long time, and it is very Italian there. So the fights are very, very vigorous. Today, I still know the leading winemakers, you may have drunk them, Zuccardi and Catena, will not come to the same meeting room together. They send their representatives. But the fact is they keep sending their representatives when there are big decisions to be made. Whereas before, they just plan to undermine one another. So this not only changes politics, but it actually, and we statistically show this, it changes the whole innovation ecosystem, a word that's been brought up throughout the talks. So what we're talking about here is how do you build the ecosystems? And we think that this is relevant to Argentina, again, or South Carolina, the basic approach here, which is this, is that recombination is the key to innovation, and especially with applied and experiential knowledge. Now, we know that pioneering knowledge is very, very important. I'm not saying don't do those things. Research universities, for instance, are really important. But I want you to understand that if you don't have this base, this ecosystem of firms that understand how to use that pioneering knowledge, then your investments are for naught. That's what I would argue. And the fact is that often this applied knowledge is fragmented. And public policy can change this game because it can create new types of institutions that not only provide relevant services, but moreover can be constructed in a way so as to build new types of social and professional networks. Essentially, these institutions can act as knowledge and social bridges between previously isolated, innovative, or producer communities. And then the next step is that the firms themselves are accessing a greater diversity of applied knowledge that they never had access to before. And what we've seen again and again and again is this accelerates innovation rates and learning rates extraordinarily. So just a few resources being combined in a very simple way or recombined in a simple way can actually lead to much greater innovation rates. And that's my talk. Thank you very much.